My name is Thaddeus Everwind. 3 weeks ago, I was just a meteorologist predicting rainfall. Now I'm one of the few survivors of a zombie apocalypse that consumed my town in 48 brutal hours. I watched neighbors transform into monsters. I used weather patterns to predict zombie movements. I fought infected colleagues. This is how meteorology saved my life. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Thaddeus Everwind, former senior meteorologist for Channel 7 News in Lakeside, Arizona. I'm recording this testimony from the Mount Davis weather station, where I've been surviving for the past 3 weeks since the initial outbreak. If you're watching this, you've managed to stay alive somehow, and maybe what I'm about to share will help keep you that way a little longer. I want to explain how my background in meteorology, something that seems completely unrelated to survival, ended up being the difference between life and death during the first 48 hours of what I can only call the apocalypse. Before all this happened, my life was ordinary, predictable even, ironic for someone whose job was predicting the unpredictable. Every morning I'd wake up at 5:30, check my personal weather instruments on my apartment balcony, shower, have coffee, and head to the station to prepare the day's forecast. Lakeside was just your average mid-sized desert town in Arizona. Nothing special about it except maybe the water tower that supplied most of the city, a landmark you could see from almost anywhere in town. I had good colleagues at the station. Rebecca handled the morning broadcast, Carlos managed our technical equipment, and I provided the science and forecasts. I also had a friend, Dr. Eliza Chen, who worked at the water treatment facility. We'd met at a city planning meeting about drought contingency planning last year. She was brilliant, a microbiologist who took her job of keeping our water safe very seriously. In the week before everything happened, I'd noticed some unusual readings on my personal weather station. Nothing dramatic, just unexpected pressure changes, humidity fluctuations that didn't align with my models. Small anomalies that in retrospect were like the first distant rumbles of thunder before a devastating storm. I'd also been gathering water quality reports for a potential story about infrastructure investment. Eliza had mentioned some concerns, but I didn't give them much thought at the time. It all started on Tuesday, July 12, 2022. The temperature hit 103 degrees by noon, hot even for Arizona in July. I remember my morning perfectly because it was the last normal one I would ever have. I showered with water that tasted slightly metallic, had breakfast while reviewing satellite imagery, and headed to the station to prepare the weekend forecast. Nothing seemed out of place except that metallic taste in the water, which I dismissed as probably due to some maintenance work on the pipes. Around 10 that morning, I started noticing increased chatter on the police scanner I kept in my office. More calls than usual about erratic behavior at different locations around town. Several calls from Westlake Medical Center requesting additional security. A cluster of illness reports near the water treatment plant. 3 of my colleagues had called in sick with what everyone was calling summer flu. And I had a voicemail from Eliza that I hadn't listened to yet. When I finally played Eliza's message during my lunch break, her voice sounded tense. "Thaddeus, I need to talk to you about those water samples you asked about. We're detecting some anomalous biological particles that shouldn't be there. Call me back as soon as you can." I tried calling her back, but she didn't answer. I made a mental note to try again later, and went back to analyzing a developing storm system moving in from the Gulf. It was about 2 in the afternoon when everything changed. I was at my desk when I heard Mrs. Caldwell screaming from the courtyard of my apartment complex. I lived on the 2nd floor, so I went to the balcony to see what was happening. Howard Caldwell, a retired accountant who spent most days tending his roses and complaining about property taxes, was lurching across their front lawn toward his wife. His movements were jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. His white polo shirt was stained dark red down the front. "Howard, please," she cried as he approached. "What's wrong with you?" He didn't respond with words, just a horrible guttural moan as he lunged forward and bit into her shoulder. Her screams changed from fear to pain in an instant. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. Howard Caldwell, attacking his wife of 40 years? It made no sense. I grabbed my phone to call 911 but couldn't connect. All circuits are busy, the automated voice informed me. That's when I noticed other sounds filtering through the neighborhood, car alarms, distant screams, what might have been gunshots from downtown. The local news station I had playing in the background switched from regular programming to an emergency broadcast. This is an emergency alert. The Centers for Disease Control and the Department of Public Health have issued an urgent warning for Lakeside and surrounding counties. Stay in your homes. Lock all doors and windows. Do not attempt to reach loved ones. If you encounter an infected individual, do not approach them under any circumstances. Symptoms include disorientation, aggression, and physical violence. Remain indoors until the broadcast cut out. Through my window, I could see black smoke rising from several locations downtown. 3 miles away, the water tower that supplied most of Lakeside stood silhouetted against the relentless sun. Something clicked in my mind. As a meteorologist, my job is to see patterns forming before others do. I track how systems develop and predict their trajectories. And what I was seeing now wasn't just random chaos. It was spreading outward from our water supply like a pressure system. I thought back to the metallic taste in my tap water that morning, Eliza's voicemail about anomalous biological particles, the cluster of illness reports near the water treatment facility, the colleagues calling in sick, all radiating outward from our water supply. I had to move fast. The pattern suggested whatever was happening would spread throughout the entire water system rapidly. I grabbed my emergency backpack, the one I'd prepared for severe weather events that I might need to cover in person. Every meteorologist in tornado or hurricane zones keeps one ready. Mine contained a weather radio, first aid kit, bottled water, energy bars, field notebooks, extra batteries, a flashlight, and a multi-tool. I started adding other items I thought might be useful. My handheld barometer, a detailed topographic map of the region, my spare phone charger, and a photo of my parents. Through the walls, I could hear strange noises from other apartments. Thumping, moaning, breaking glass. My mind went to the Mount Davis weather station outside town. It was isolated, positioned on high ground, had solar power, and most importantly, collected rainwater for its needs rather than relying on the city water supply. I'd spent many shifts there monitoring severe weather systems. If I could reach it, I might have a chance. I was just finishing packing when someone pounded on my door frantically. Through the peephole, I saw the teenager from apartment 4C, a high school kid named Alex who sometimes helped carry groceries for elderly residents. Blood streaked his face, but his eyes were clear and terrified. "Please," he gasped when I opened the door. "Something's wrong with my mom." She tried to bite me. "Everyone's going crazy." From the stairwell came the sounds of shuffling feet and moans. I pulled Alex inside and locked the door. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice cracking. I quickly explained my theory about the water supply while adding more bottled water to my pack. "When did your mom start acting strange?" I asked. "Right after lunch. She came home early from work saying she felt sick." More data points for my theory. The infection was spreading faster than I'd anticipated. From the stairwell, the moaning grew louder. Multiple infected, not just one. We needed to leave immediately. "We need to get out of town," I told him, showing him the map with Mount Davis circled. "Somewhere isolated where we can figure out what's happening and wait for help." Alex nodded, still in shock but understanding the urgency. I gave him a bottle of water from my pack. "Don't drink tap water. Nothing from the faucet, you understand? I think that's how it's spreading." Together we planned our route, avoiding main streets where infected would likely concentrate. I grabbed my car keys, hoping we could drive at least part of the way before roads became impassable. As we prepared to leave my apartment, I realized that my understanding of patterns and prediction models would be the difference between life and death over the next 48 hours. The storm was just beginning, and I needed every bit of my meteorological training to navigate it. The building manager, Mr. Diaz, was our first encounter. We found him in the hallway outside my apartment, moving with that same jerky gait I'd seen in Howard Caldwell. His uniform was soaked with what looked like blood, his eyes milky and unfocused. Back inside, I whispered to Alex, pulling him away from the door. We need another way out. We used the fire escape instead, descending quickly to the parking lot. But my car wouldn't start. Something was wrong with the electrical system. And the streets were filling with more infected people, moving with that same uncoordinated shambling. We need to go on foot, I told Alex. Stay close and quiet. I think they respond to sound. We moved through back alleys, avoiding main streets where infected seemed to be gathering in growing numbers. Using my mental map of the town, I navigated us toward less populated areas. How do you know where to go? Alex whispered as we crouched behind a dumpster, waiting for an infected mail carrier to shamble past. Weather patterns, I explained. The infected are spreading like a weather front from the water tower. If we move perpendicular to the spread, we can find thinner concentrations. I was already thinking of them in meteorological terms: pressure systems, fronts, currents. It was the only framework I had to make sense of the chaos, and it seemed to be working. We made it 6 blocks without direct confrontation. The gas station on Willow Street was our first stop for supplies. A small group of survivors had gathered. There, a middle-aged woman named Karen with her elderly father, a construction worker named Miguel, and a young couple whose names I didn't catch. The military set up an evacuation point at the high school, Miguel was saying as we approached cautiously. At least that's what I heard before my radio died. It's not just here, Karen added. My sister in Phoenix said the same thing is happening there. Then the call dropped. I shared my water theory with them, but not everyone was convinced. That's ridiculous, the young man said. How would something like that even get in the water supply? Before I could respond, glass shattered at the front of the store. A group of infected burst through, moving faster than the ones we'd seen earlier. Everyone scattered in panic. Alex, stay with me, I shouted, but in the chaos, we were separated. I saw him running north with Karen and her father while I was forced east by the approaching infected. I had a split-second decision to make: try to find Alex in the chaos or continue alone toward Mount Davis. With infected between us and their numbers growing, I chose to stick to the plan. I hoped he would remember our conversation about the TU weather station and perhaps make his way there. As I looked back at the gas station, now overrun with infected, I realized something crucial. They moved like particles in an air current, following the path of least resistance. That observation would save my life multiple times in the hours ahead. The temperature continued climbing throughout the day, reaching 108 degrees by early afternoon. I noticed something important. The infected became noticeably slower in the extreme heat. They still pursued movement and sound, but their reactions were delayed, their already uncoordinated movements even more sluggish. I began using sun-exposed routes deliberately, timing my movements across open areas when the infected seemed most affected by the heat. My years of studying how weather affects physical systems were becoming surprisingly applicable to survival. I started documenting my observations in my field notebook, just as I would during a severe weather event. The infected responded primarily to sound, secondarily to movement. They showed no signs of higher reasoning but demonstrated basic problem-solving when pursuing prey. They appeared to have poor vision but excellent hearing, and most importantly, their activity level seemed directly correlated with ambient temperature. I needed to approach downtown strategically. From my vantage point atop an abandoned delivery truck, I could see that the infection had spread throughout most of Lakeside. The streets were increasingly filled with infected moving in loose groups, like weather systems merging as pressure differentials equalize. They seemed to concentrate in areas where buildings created natural funnels, just like wind patterns through an urban environment. The Channel 7 news building stood about half a mile away. If I could reach it, I might find more information about what was happening, maybe even functioning communications equipment. The building had emergency generators and satellite uplinks designed to operate during severe weather emergencies. Plus, I knew the layout perfectly, including all the emergency exits. Using the tallest buildings as markers, I plotted a route that would keep me away from the largest concentrations of infected. I noticed military helicopters passing overhead without stopping, heading west, away from the city. not a good sign for anyone hoping for immediate rescue. Just like wind follows the path between buildings, the infected seemed to cluster in areas of least resistance. I muttered to myself, falling back on the habit of narrating observations as if I were recording field notes. The comparison helped me predict where they might gather and which routes might be clearer. The heat was becoming an ally. At 108 degrees, the infected were noticeably sluggish, some barely moving at all in direct sunlight. I timed my movements to coincide with the hottest part of the day, using shadows to conceal myself when necessary, but generally, staying in the heat that the infected seemed to find debilitating. Reaching the Channel 7 building was emotionally jarring. This place had been my professional home for years. Now the front doors were shattered, blood smeared across the reception desk. The silence was eerie after the constant background noise of news production that usually filled these halls. The newsroom was in disarray, chairs overturned, computers still running emergency broadcasts on loops, half-empty coffee cups on desks. No sign of my colleagues, though a trail of blood led from Rebecca's desk to the stairwell. I didn't follow it. The emergency broadcast system was still functioning, though only broadcasting pre-recorded CDC warnings. Avoid all contact with infected individuals. Infection spreads through bites and exposure to bodily fluids. Symptoms develop rapidly, including fever, aggression, and loss of cognitive function. Remain indoors until military evacuation can be arranged. In the research department, I found something valuable. Initial CDC reports about the pathogen. It confirmed my water supply theory. An unknown biological agent had been detected in the lakeside reservoir approximately 36 hours before the first reported cases. Most critically, the reports contained observations about the infected's sensitivity to temperature extremes. They became less mobile in high heat and appeared to slow down in very cold environments as well. I downloaded what data I could to my phone and gathered better supplies from the station's emergency kit, a proper first aid kit, a satellite phone that was unfortunately not receiving signals, and a hand-crank emergency radio. Most importantly, I found a set of walkie-talkies with good range, which might prove useful if I encountered other survivors. The research department also had detailed topographic maps of the entire region, far better than my mental map. I carefully marked the route to Mount Davis, calculating distances and estimating travel time on foot. 20 miles normally, but with detours to avoid infected concentrations, probably closer to 25. Using the station's elevated position, I spent an hour systematically documenting the pattern of the outbreak across Lakeside. The pattern was undeniable. The infection had radiated outward from the water tower, just as a weather front would spread. The highest concentration of infected was in areas directly served by the main water lines, while outlying areas with well water showed fewer signs of the outbreak. I created a makeshift experiment to test the infected's response to sound. Dropping a stapler from a second-floor window, I observed how they reacted, immediately converging on the noise from all directions, like particles drawn to a low-pressure system. They remained at the source for several minutes before dispersing when no further stimuli appeared. As I watched their movements, I began to develop a more comprehensive theory about their behavior. They weren't just mindless, they had patterns, just like weather systems do. Understanding those patterns was key to predicting their movements, and prediction meant survival. With the day's heat beginning to wane, I knew I needed to move soon. The infected would become more active as temperatures dropped, but I also knew exactly where I needed to go. The Mount Davis weather station was looking increasingly like my best chance for long-term survival. Located 20 miles outside town at an elevation of 4,600 feet, the station had been built to withstand extreme conditions. It was solar-powered with backup generators, had its own rainwater collection system completely unconnected to the city water supply, and was stocked with supplies meant for week-long weather monitoring sessions during storm season. Most importantly, it was isolated and defensible, with only one access road and clear sightlines in all directions. I'd spent countless shifts there monitoring weather patterns in isolation. Now that isolation might save my life. I packed my new supplies, studied my route one final time, and prepared to leave the news station as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The temperature was starting to drop, and with it, the infected were becoming more active. I needed to move quickly but cautiously. Using the station's back exit, I slipped out into the alley, working my way toward the eastern edge of town where population density was lower. My progress was slow but deliberate. Every intersection required careful assessment before crossing. Every unusual sound meant freezing in place until I could identify the source. The walkie-talkie occasionally crackled with fragments of communications, other survivors trying to coordinate, military channels with partial information, but nothing clear enough to change my plans. As dusk approached, I found an unexpected resource, an abandoned bicycle behind a convenience store. It wasn't in perfect condition, but the tires held air and the chain still worked. This would significantly reduce my travel time if I could navigate safely. The buildings were thinning out as I reached the eastern neighborhoods. Small suburban homes with yards gave way to larger properties and eventually rural developments. The density of infected decreased correspondingly, though isolated ones appeared unpredictably. I was making good progress when the pattern changed. A massive group of infected appeared ahead, blocking my direct route east. There must have been at least 50 of them, moving together like a weather front across my planned path. I needed a new approach. Observing from behind an abandoned car, I noticed they were moving with purpose, not randomly as the individual infected had been. The group flowed like floodwaters through the streets, following paths of least resistance between buildings and obstacles. The meteorologist in me immediately recognized fluid dynamics principles at work. If they moved like a fluid, then I could predict their path based on the urban topography. I studied the street layout, noting how the buildings and abandoned vehicles created natural channels. The infected would follow the path of least resistance, flowing around obstacles rather than over them. I identified a narrow passage between two buildings where their flow would be constricted, like a bottleneck in a stream. If I could reach the other side of that constriction and then move perpendicular to their flow, I might find a gap in their coverage. The risk was substantial. If my prediction was wrong, I'd be trapped. But my entire career had been built on pattern recognition and predictive modeling. I had to trust my instincts. Finding an abandoned car with a working alarm system, I triggered it from a distance. The noise immediately attracted the horde, pulling them away from my planned route like a low-pressure system attracting air currents. As they converged on the sound, I pedaled hard through the gap I'd identified, moving perpendicular to their flow exactly as I'd planned. My theory proved correct. Their movement patterns followed predictable laws of fluid dynamics. I made it through with only 2 infected breaking away to pursue me, and their slower speed allowed me to outpace them easily on the bicycle. As full darkness fell, navigation became more challenging. The familiar constellations overhead provided basic directional guidance, but I needed to find shelter soon. Traveling by night posed too many risks. Unseen infected, potential injuries, and the rapidly cooling desert air that seemed to make the infected more aggressive. In the distance, I could hear what might have been gunfire or explosions, evidence of other survivors or perhaps military activity. Several times I spotted the lights of vehicles moving rapidly along distant roads. I was tempted to try to flag them down but decided against it. My observations suggested larger groups attracted more infected. My best chance remained reaching Mount Davis alone. The first drops of rain caught me by surprise. Weather forecasting had been my job for years, but the stress and chaos of the day had distracted me from the building monsoon conditions. A summer storm was developing rapidly. Unusual timing for this region, but not unprecedented. The weather radio crackled with an automated alert. The National Weather Service has issued a severe thunderstorm warning for Lakeside County and surrounding areas. Expect heavy rainfall, lightning, and potential flash flooding in low-lying areas. Take shelter immediately. I needed to find secure shelter before the storm hit in full force. The rain was already increasing in intensity, and with it, I noticed something alarming. The infected I could see were becoming more active, more aggressive as the rain fell on them. The water seemed to energize them somehow, like plants after a drought. About half a mile ahead, I spotted a storage facility, rows of metal units with roll-up doors. If I could secure one of those units, it might provide shelter for the night. I pedaled harder, racing against the intensifying storm. The storage facility was thankfully deserted, at least of the living. 2 infected wandered the central lane between rows of units, but they were easily avoided. Finding a unit with a partially open door, I slipped inside and pulled it closed, securing it with a padlock I found discarded nearby. The space was cramped but dry, filled with someone's stored furniture and boxes. As thunder rumbled overhead and rain hammered on the metal roof, I settled in for the night, using my flashlight sparingly to conserve battery. Throughout the night, I could hear infected moving outside, scratching occasionally at the metal door. Their moans seemed to intensify with each lightning strike, as if the electrical energy in the air affected them somehow. The storm raged for hours, giving me plenty of time to analyze my observations and refine my theories. I began documenting everything in my field notebook, just as I would during a severe weather event. The infected responded primarily to sound, secondarily to movement. They showed no signs of higher reasoning but demonstrated basic problem-solving when pursuing prey. They appeared to have poor vision but excellent hearing. And most importantly, their activity level seemed directly correlated with environmental conditions: sluggish in extreme heat, more active in cooler temperatures, and particularly animated during the thunderstorm. As I listened to them throughout the night, I began to notice patterns in their vocalizations, almost like they were communicating in some primitive way. The meteorologist in me couldn't help but compare it to how pressure systems interact across regions, creating complex patterns that influence each other. By morning, I had developed a comprehensive theory about their behavior that would either get me safely to Mount Davis or get me killed. The storm had passed, but the real test was still ahead. Dawn brought renewed hope and clearer conditions after the storm. The landscape was transformed. Puddles everywhere, debris scattered by wind, but thankfully fewer infected visible in the immediate area. The temperature was still cool from the night and rain, which meant the infected would remain highly active until the day heated up. I needed to use this time efficiently. I checked my supplies, plotted my route using the topographic map, and prepared for the final leg of my journey to Mount Davis. The mountain was visible in the distance, its weather station tower just barely distinguishable against the sky. As I emerged cautiously from the storage unit, I surveyed the post-storm environment. The infected had dispersed somewhat, though I could see a few wandering between buildings in the distance. The bicycle remained where I'd hidden it, though. The rain had rusted some of its components. It would still function for the journey ahead. Taking one last look at the devastated town below me, I felt a strange mixture of grief and determination. Just days ago, I had been just another meteorologist, predicting rain chances and temperature fluctuations. Now I was using those same skills to predict something far deadlier. In meteorology, we have a saying, I whispered to myself as I mounted the bicycle. The atmosphere always gives you clues if you know how to read them. The same was true for surviving this outbreak. The infected gave clues about their behavior if you knew how to observe them properly. I set course for Mount Davis using the position of the morning sun, leaving behind the ruins of the life I had known. The transformation from weather predictor to survivor was complete, but my journey was far from over. The final ascent to safety still lay ahead, and with it, challenges I couldn't yet predict. As I moved beyond the town boundaries, the landscape transitioned from suburban to rural. Fields stretched out on either side of the road, some with crops now untended, others with dry desert scrub. The reduced population density gave me a false sense of security at first. Fewer buildings meant fewer people, which logically should have meant fewer infected. But I quickly discovered that wasn't entirely true. The infected had spread beyond the town, though in smaller numbers. I encountered them occasionally along the road, solitary figures shambling through fields or small groups clustered around rural homes. I kept my distance, sticking to the shoulder of the road where I could pedal quickly but dive into the brush if necessary. The day was heating up, the sun already intense despite the earlier rain. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed back into the 90s, and I could observe the infected becoming sluggish again in the heat. I used this to my advantage, traveling in the open when possible, knowing their reactions would be delayed. About 5 miles from town, I encountered something unexpected. an infected coyote. The animal moved with the same jerky motions as the human infected, foam dripping from its jaws as it tried to pursue my bicycle. I easily outpaced it, but the implications were terrifying. The infection affected wildlife too. Cross-species transmission meant the problem could be far more widespread than I'd initially thought. I wondered what other animals might be affected. Birds? Insects? The potential ecological impact was staggering, but more immediately concerning was the danger this posed to survivors. Not only did we need to avoid infected humans, but potentially infected wildlife as well. The terrain was becoming more challenging as I approached the foothills leading to Mount Davis. The gentle slopes slowly gave way to steeper inclines, making cycling more difficult. I pushed on, conserving my water and using terrain features for protection whenever I spotted infected in the distance. My physical exhaustion was becoming a factor. I hadn't slept well in the storage unit, and the combination of stress, exertion, and limited food was taking its toll. My meteorological training had prepared me for extended field work in difficult conditions, but nothing like this sustained survival situation. Around noon, I spotted signs of military activity, fresh, tire tracks on a dirt road intersecting my route, shell casings glinting in the sun, and at one point, an abandoned Humvee tilted into a ditch. No personnel in sight, but evidence they had been here recently. I checked the vehicle for supplies or information but found nothing useful. The radio was smashed, and any weapons or medical supplies had been taken. The presence of military so far from town suggested they had been attempting to establish a perimeter or evacuation route. Their absence now wasn't encouraging. Had they pulled back to a more defensible position, or had they been overrun? Either way, it reinforced my decision to reach Mount Davis rather than search for evacuation points that might no longer exist. I avoided main roads, knowing they would be the most likely routes for large groups, both survivors and infected. Instead, I used my topographic map to identify smaller access roads and trails that would lead me toward the mountain. The going was slower but safer with fewer encounters. By early afternoon, the heat had become oppressive, pushing well above 100 degrees again. I found myself seeking shade more frequently, conserving energy during the hottest part of the day. During one of these rest periods, I observed an infected stumbling across an open field in the distance. As I watched, it seemed to grow progressively slower until it finally collapsed, motionless in the direct sun. This confirmed my theory about their temperature sensitivity. Extreme heat debilitated them completely, perhaps even permanently. I made a note of the exact temperature and conditions, adding to my growing knowledge base about their weaknesses. The mountain was becoming more prominent on the horizon, and with it, my hope grew. I estimated I had covered about 15 miles from town, with perhaps 5 to 7 remaining depending on my route. If I maintained my current pace, I could reach the weather station by evening. The approach to Mount Davis required crossing a short stretch of exposed landscape before reaching the access road that wound up the mountain. As I studied this final segment through my small binoculars, I spotted movement along the access road, a small group of infected, perhaps 5 or 6, milling around an overturned emergency vehicle. Their presence on the access road was concerning. It meant either survivors had tried to reach the weather station before me, or perhaps staff had been evacuated and encountered problems. Either way, I needed to find a way past them to reach the station. I spent nearly an hour observing their movements, looking for patterns just as I would study cloud formations or pressure systems. They remained clustered near the vehicle, occasionally wandering a short distance before returning. They didn't appear to be coordinating or patrolling, just existing in a limited area. Using my understanding of their behavior, I developed a plan. The infected responded primarily to sound, so creating a distraction might draw them away from the access road long enough for me to pass. The question was, what kind of distraction would be effective enough without putting me at risk? The answer came from my meteorological background. Fire creates updrafts in the atmosphere. Smoke rises, carrying sound waves differently than still air. If I could create a controlled burn in the brush some distance from the access road, It might draw them away both through the sound of crackling flames and the visual stimulus of smoke and fire. It was risky. Wildfires were dangerous under normal circumstances, let alone in an apocalyptic scenario with no fire department. But using my knowledge of the local wind patterns and the recent rainfall, I identified a location where a small fire could be contained naturally by rocky ground and prevailing wind direction. I gathered dry brush and small branches, creating a pile about 100 yards from the access road but in the infected's line of sight. Using matches from my emergency kit, I set it alight, then quickly retreated to a position where I could observe both the fire and the infected's response. The effect was immediate and exactly as I'd predicted. All 5 infected turned toward the fire and began moving toward it, drawn by the crackling sound and the movement of the flames. Within minutes, the access road was clear. I didn't waste the opportunity, pedaling hard up the access road, pushing through my fatigue. The incline was steep, forcing me to dismount and push the bicycle at several points, but I maintained steady progress. The infected remained distracted by the fire, which burned in a controlled manner just as I'd calculated. As I reached the first switchback in the road, I caught my first clear view of the weather station. The facility sat atop the mountain, its radar dome and instrument array visible against the sky. But something was wrong. The main door appeared to be damaged, hanging partially open. The sight sent a chill through me despite the heat. The station might not be the safe haven I'd hoped for. It might already be compromised. But I had come too far to turn back now, and even a damaged weather station was better than no shelter at all. I continued up the road, more cautious now, watching for any sign of infected near the station itself. The final approach was tense. I abandoned the bicycle about 100 yards from the station, proceeding on foot to minimize noise. The station appeared deserted, no movement visible. Through the windows, no sounds except the wind through the instrument arrays. The damaged door swung slightly in the breeze. I approached with extreme caution, my makeshift weapon, the barometer with its metal housing, held ready. The door had been forced open from the outside, the frame splintered around the lock. Inside, papers were scattered across the floor of the main monitoring room. A chair overturned, but otherwise the equipment appeared intact. "Hello?" I called softly, moving through the facility room by room. No response. The living quarters were empty, beds unmade as if departed in a hurry. The kitchen showed signs of a hasty meal abandoned. But no blood, no signs of violence beyond. The broken door. The relief of finding the station unoccupied by infected was overwhelming. I secured the damaged door as best I could with equipment from the maintenance closet, then did a methodical inventory of supplies. The situation was better than I'd dared hope. The solar power system was functioning, providing electricity to essential systems. The rainwater collection tank was nearly full after the previous night's storm. There were enough non-perishable food supplies to last several weeks if carefully rationed. Most importantly, the communications equipment was intact, though I quickly discovered that most channels were dead. The satellite uplink functioned, but there appeared to be no satellites responding, or at least none transmitting public information. The emergency radio picked up only automated messages, the same ones I'd heard in town, now on repeat. I tried broadcasting on several emergency frequencies. "This is Thaddeus Everwind at the Mount Davis weather station. I am a survivor seeking contact with any emergency services or other survivors. Please respond." But only static answered. As the sun began to set, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I had survived the first 36 hours of the outbreak. I had food, water, shelter, and security. I had made it to my destination against significant odds, but I was also completely alone, with no clear idea of how widespread the catastrophe was or whether help would ever come. The isolation was familiar, at least. I had worked many solitary shifts at this station, monitoring weather systems while cut off from human contact. The difference now was that I didn't know when, or if, my shift would end. I established a routine immediately, falling back on the discipline that had served me well as a meteorologist. First, I secured the station completely, reinforcing the damaged door and checking all other potential entry points. Then I took inventory of all supplies and equipment, organizing them for maximum efficiency. Finally, I began setting up monitoring systems, not just for weather as the station was designed for, but for infected activity as well. The station's elevated position gave me excellent visibility of the surrounding area. Using the facility's binoculars, I could observe movement for miles in every direction. I began mapping infected concentrations just as I would track weather systems, noting their positions and movements at regular intervals. The weather monitoring equipment was fully functional, and I found myself automatically checking the readings, out of professional habit. Barometric pressure, wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, all the factors I'd built my career around monitoring. But now I was correlating these factors with infected behavior, looking for patterns that might help me predict their movements. As night fell completely, I observed an interesting phenomenon through the night vision equipment. The infected seemed to become more active in the cooler temperatures, just as I'd observed in town, but they also appeared to be moving in loosely. Coordinated groups almost like schools of fish or flocks of birds. Their movements weren't random but followed certain implicit rules that I was beginning to recognize. I began documenting everything meticulously, creating a log of observations and theories. If other survivors ever found this place, or if I ever managed to establish contact with authorities, this information could be valuable. Understanding infected behavior patterns could save lives. The station's computer system still functioned, allowing me to analyze weather data from before the outbreak. Looking at patterns from the previous weeks, I noticed something odd, subtle but significant atmospheric pressure anomalies beginning approximately 3 days before the first reported infections. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alerts, but unusual nonetheless. Could there be a connection between these atmospheric changes and the outbreak? It seemed far-fetched, but then again, so did the idea of a zombie apocalypse before I'd witnessed it firsthand. I noted the correlation for further investigation. As I prepared for my first night at the station, I did one final check of the communications equipment, scanning all frequencies for any sign of human contact. Mostly static, but on one emergency band, I picked up a broken transmission. Any survivors Lakeside area respond. Military secure zone established at Green Valley Base. Evacuation procedures in effect for confirmed uninfected. Approach South Checkpoint for screening. Repeat. Any survivors. The transmission cut out before I could hear more, and despite repeated attempts, I couldn't re-establish the signal. But it confirmed what I had hoped. Organized human resistance existed, and evacuation efforts were underway. Green Valley was about 30 miles southwest of my position, beyond a series of difficult mountain ranges. Not an easy journey, but knowing a destination existed was valuable information. I settled in for the night, setting up a rotation of monitoring instruments and catching brief periods of rest between checks. The weather station felt secure, but I remained vigilant. The infected had surprised me before with their adaptability. I wouldn't underestimate them again. As I drifted into an exhausted sleep during one of my rest periods, my mind was already processing the patterns I'd observed, forming hypotheses and predictions. The meteorologist in me never stopped working. Even now, when the forecast I was creating wasn't about rain or sunshine, but about survival itself. By morning, I had survived the first 48 hours of the outbreak. I had reached safety, established a secure position, and begun gathering critical information about both the infected and the broader situation. My training as a meteorologist, observing patterns, making predictions based on data, understanding how systems interact, had saved my life repeatedly during those crucial hours. The morning brought clear skies and rising temperatures, but also a concerning discovery. The station's powerful telescope, normally used for observing distant storm formations, revealed something unexpected when I trained it on the groups of infected moving across the landscape below. Their movements weren't just loosely coordinated, as I'd thought. They were moving in patterns that corresponded directly to the weather fronts moving across the region. A cold front was pushing in from the north, and the infected were moving like particles in that airflow, their collective movements mirroring the atmospheric pressure changes with uncanny precision. It was as if they were connected to the weather, systems themselves responding to stimuli I couldn't yet identify. Whatever this outbreak was, I didn't think Mother Nature was done with us yet. The infected weren't just affected by the weather, they were somehow connected to it. And with the barometric pressure readings showing a massive storm system developing to the west, I feared we were about to witness the next phase of whatever this was. If you're watching this and still alive, remember that survival isn't just about outrunning the infected. It's about understanding the patterns in their behavior, in your environment, and everything around you. Stay observant, stay prepared, and most importantly, check your water before you drink it. This is Thaddeus Everwind, still predicting storms, just a very different kind now. I'll continue recording my observations in subsequent videos, sharing what I learn about the nature of this outbreak and its connection to weather phenomena. In my next recording, I'll share what happened when that massive storm system finally hit, and what it revealed about the infected that changed everything. We thought we knew. The storm system I'd detected was unlike anything I'd seen in my years as a meteorologist. The barometric pressure continued dropping at an alarming rate, and satellite imagery, the few feeds still functioning, showed a massive cyclonic formation developing to the west, far larger and more intense than typical for this region in July. Under normal circumstances, I would have been issuing severe weather warnings and coordinating with emergency management. Now I could only prepare myself and continue observing. What concerned me most wasn't just the storm itself, but how the infected might respond to it. My observations over the past day had revealed an undeniable correlation between weather patterns and infected movement. They didn't just become more active in certain conditions, they actually seemed to sense atmospheric changes before they occurred, like animals that can feel an earthquake coming. I spent the morning reinforcing the weather station's vulnerable points. The facility was designed to withstand extreme conditions, but the damaged door remained a weakness. Using materials from the maintenance supplies, I created a barricade that would hold against strong winds and, hopefully, any infected that might be drawn to the station during the storm. The communications equipment continued to pick up only fragments of transmissions, most repeating the same information about the Green Valley evacuation point. I established a regular schedule of broadcasting my own position and status, though I had no way of knowing if anyone received the messages. My supplies were well organized now. I had enough food for 3 weeks if carefully rationed, and the rainwater collection system would provide plenty of clean water, especially after the coming storm. My biggest concern was medical supplies, which were limited to a basic first aid kit. Any serious injury would be difficult to treat. Around midday, I noticed the first visible signs of the approaching system. High, thin cirrus clouds spreading across the western sky, the classic forerunner of a major front. The wind was picking up too, coming from the southwest in strengthening gusts. According to my instruments, the temperature was beginning to drop as cooler air pushed ahead of the storm. More concerning was what I observed through the binoculars. The infected on the slopes below were becoming more active, more purposeful in their movements. They were no longer wandering randomly or standing in place. They were moving generally, eastward, in the same direction as the approaching front, like particles carried in an airstream. They're becoming more coordinated, more purposeful as the temperature drops, I recorded in my observation log. It's like watching air currents strengthen as a cold front moves in. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened considerably, and the wind was strong enough to create a constant howling around the station's antennas and equipment arrays. The first raindrops began hitting the windows, fat, heavy drops that suggested significant precipitation to come. Through the telescope, I witnessed something remarkable. The infected were gathering in larger groups, moving together with an almost fluid motion. Individuals that had been isolated were joining the collective movement, as if answering some silent call. They flowed along paths of least resistance, following roads, stream beds, gaps between hills, but all moving in coordinated patterns that mirrored the atmospheric circulation. I needed to understand this phenomenon better. If the infected truly responded to weather patterns, it could be critical information for survivors. Could weather forecasting become a way to predict infected movements? Could meteorological knowledge be weaponized against them somehow? The storm hit with full force just before sunset, The rain became a torrential downpour, reducing visibility to near zero. Lightning flashed constantly, illuminating the landscape in brief, startling snapshots. The wind rattled the weather station's structure despite its reinforced construction. Between lightning flashes, I caught glimpses of the infected below. They hadn't sought shelter from the storm, quite the opposite. They were out in the open, faces turned upward toward the rain, moving more rapidly than I'd ever observed. The storm wasn't debilitating them, it was energizing them, like plants after a drought. I continued monitoring and recording, both weather data and infected behavior, looking for patterns that might explain what I was seeing. The barometric pressure had reached exceptionally low levels, consistent with a major tropical system rather than a typical desert monsoon. The temperature continued dropping, now down into the 70s, cool for a July evening in Arizona. Around 8 that evening, something extraordinary happened. A particularly intense lightning strike hit the mountainside about half a mile from the station. In the brilliant illumination that followed, I saw hundreds of infected on the slopes below, all frozen in the same position, arms outstretched toward the electrical discharge. When darkness returned, they had all changed direction, now moving toward the strike point. They were attracted to the electrical energy somehow. This wasn't just a response to sound or light. They had sensed the electromagnetic discharge and were drawn to it. I quickly reviewed my previous observations, and the pattern became clear. The infected had been increasingly active during the buildup of the storm, when atmospheric electrical charge was accumulating. Their behavior peaked during lightning activity. They were responding to electromagnetic fields. This revelation could be game-changing for survivors. Weather radar systems could potentially be used to track not just storms but infected movements. Lightning detection networks, if any still functioned, might indicate areas of highest infected activity. And most significantly, areas with frequent electrical storms might be more dangerous not just because of the weather itself, but because of how it affected the infected. As the night progressed, the storm maintained its intensity. Rain pounded the station relentlessly, and the wind found every tiny gap in the structure, creating eerie whistling sounds throughout the facility. I continued monitoring both weather instruments and the surroundings, sleeping only in brief intervals. Around 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a change in the storm's rhythm. The constant roar had shifted to a more pulsing pattern. Looking at the instruments, I saw the barometric pressure fluctuating rapidly, rising and falling in quick succession, something I'd never observed in a natural storm system. Through the night vision equipment, I saw something that defied explanation. The infected were moving in circular patterns now, hundreds of them forming a rough spiral on the slopes below the station, mirroring the cyclonic rotation of the storm system above. It wasn't random movement. They were creating a human vortex, rotating counterclockwise just like the low-pressure system overhead. I struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. Were they merely responding to local wind patterns? That seemed unlikely given the terrain would disrupt surface winds. Was it some form of primitive collective behavior? Possibly, but the precision of their movement suggested something more. They were synchronized with the storm itself, as if they were part of its system. I spent the rest of the night documenting everything, taking photographs through the telescope, and correlating the infected movements with meteorological readings. By morning, I had compiled enough data to confirm my suspicion. The infected weren't just affected by the weather. They were somehow connected to it at a fundamental level. Dawn brought a temporary lull in the storm, though the clouds remained dark and threatening. The barometric pressure had stabilized at an unusually low level, and the radar showed the system had stalled over our region, rotating in place rather than moving eastward as would be expected. The infected had dispersed somewhat from their nighttime spiral formation, but remained unusually concentrated around the station's mountain. Using the telescope, I studied individual infected more carefully in the improved visibility. Something had changed in their appearance. Their skin seemed to have taken on a grayish-blue tinge, and their movements, while still uncoordinated, appeared more fluid than before. I noted another concerning development. They were climbing higher up the mountain than they had previously attempted. Before the storm, They had remained mostly on the lower slopes and along the access road. Now they were navigating the steeper terrain, slowly but persistently making their way upward toward the station. Their behavior suggested they knew I was here. Not through sight or sound. The station was too well insulated for them to hear me, and at that distance they couldn't possibly see movement through the windows. They sensed my presence somehow, perhaps through the electrical activity of my own body or the equipment I was using. I needed to prepare for the possibility that they might reach the station. The barricaded door would hold against a few, but if they came in large numbers, they might eventually break through. I gathered potential weapons, tools from the maintenance closet, a fire extinguisher that could temporarily blind them, the legs from a broken chair that could serve as clubs. The storm intensified again around midday, bringing a new wave of heavy rain and electrical activity. With the renewed storm energy, the infected became more aggressive in their upward climb. They were navigating the rocky terrain with more coordination than before, finding paths that I wouldn't have expected them capable of identifying. I theorized that the storm was somehow enhancing their capabilities. Perhaps the electrical energy in the atmosphere was stimulating whatever remained of their nervous systems, making them more effective predators. If true, this had frightening implications for survivors in storm-prone regions. By early afternoon, the first of them had reached the small plateau where the weather station stood. A female infected in what remained of a postal worker's uniform, her skin now that same grayish blue I'd observed in others, her movements more deliberate than the shambling gait I'd seen in the early infected. She approached the station directly, as if she knew exactly where the entrance was located. More followed, a man in tattered business attire, an elderly woman, a teenager wearing what looked like a fast food uniform, all showing the same skin discoloration, all moving with that same purposeful direction. Within an hour, approximately 20 infected had gathered around the station, probing the doors and windows, searching for a way in. The barricade held, but their persistent pressure was concerning. More concerning was their behavior. They weren't just randomly pushing against the barriers, they were systematically testing different points, almost like they were problem-solving. When one approach failed, they tried another. This was far more coordinated than anything I'd observed in the early stages of the outbreak. As night approached again, I faced a difficult decision. The infected surrounding the station showed no signs of losing interest. If anything, their numbers were growing as more climbed the mountain. The station remained secure for now, but how long would that last? Should I attempt to leave under cover of darkness, making my way toward the Green Valley evacuation point? Or was I safer remaining in place despite the growing threat outside? The meteorologist in me analyzed the variables methodically. The mind storm showed no signs of dissipating, unusual for a system in this region which typically moved through quickly. The infected were demonstrating enhanced capabilities during the storm. Traveling cross-country in these conditions would be extremely hazardous. Visibility was poor, the terrain treacherous when wet, and the infected were more active than ever. Staying put was the logical choice, at least until the storm passed. I had supplies, shelter, and security, even if somewhat compromised. I reinforced the barricades as best I could and established a rotation of monitoring both the weather instruments and the infected activity outside. Through the night, the storm maintained its unnatural intensity. Lightning struck repeatedly near the station, and with each electrical discharge, the infected outside became more frenzied in their attempts to enter. They were feeding off the electrical energy somehow, using it to fuel their assault on my shelter. I observed them through the security cameras, noticing how they seemed to anticipate the lightning strikes, turning toward the likely strike point seconds before the flash. Their connection to the atmospheric electrical field was becoming more apparent and more disturbing. Around midnight, I made another significant discovery. Reviewing the weather data from the past 48 hours alongside my observations of infected behavior, I noticed a perfect correlation between barometric pressure fluctuations and changes in infected activity levels. When pressure dropped rapidly, they became more coordinated and aggressive. When it stabilized or rose slightly, they became more individual and less effective. This information could be vital for survivor groups. Barometric pressure readings, which any basic weather station could provide, might serve as an early warning system for increased infected threat levels. Areas experiencing significant low-pressure systems might need enhanced security during those periods. The night brought another development. The infected began making sounds I hadn't heard before. Not just the typical moans and growls, but something that sounded almost like words, distorted and unintelligible but with speech-like patterns. They called to each other, one initiating a sound and others responding, creating a chilling chorus that rose and fell with the intensity of the storm. I recorded these vocalizations, analyzing them as best I could with the station's audio equipment. There were definite patterns, repetitions that suggested some form of communication rather than random noise. Were they developing a primitive language? Or was this something else entirely? Perhaps some kind of resonance with the storm's own frequencies. By dawn, the situation had escalated further. The infected had managed to damage one of the ground floor windows. Not enough to gain entry, but enough to create a weakness that would eventually fail if they continued their assault. I moved essential supplies to the upper level of the facility, preparing for the possibility of abandoning the ground floor if necessary. The storm showed its first signs of weakening as the sun rose, the wind decreasing slightly, the rain becoming less intense, though still steady. With this change in the storm, I observed a corresponding shift in infected behavior. They became somewhat less coordinated, their assault on the station less focused. Some began to wander away from the main group, returning to more individual behavior patterns. This confirmed my theory about the correlation between storm intensity and infected capabilities. As the atmospheric electrical activity decreased, so did their enhanced functions. They were reverting to their baseline behavior as the storm weakened. I took advantage of this lull to further secure the damaged window and assess the station's condition after nearly 24 hours of assault. The structure had held up well overall, though I noted several points that would need reinforcement before the next storm. The weather radar showed the system finally beginning to move eastward, though another formation was already developing to the southwest. If the pattern continued, we might be facing a sequence of unusual storm systems rather than isolated events. I needed to prepare for recurring periods of enhanced infected activity corresponding with each new weather front. As midday approached, and the rain diminished to a light drizzle, the number of infected around the station decreased significantly. Most returned to the lower slopes, though a few remained nearby, as if maintaining a watch on my position. Their skin coloration was fading from the grayish-blue back to a more normal pallor, another indication that their enhanced state was directly tied to the storm's electrical energy. I took the opportunity to broadcast again on all emergency frequencies, sharing my observations about the correlation between weather patterns and infected behavior. Whether anyone was receiving these transmissions remained unknown, but documenting and sharing this information felt like my responsibility as perhaps the only meteorologist making these specific observations. Attention, any receiving stations. This is Thaddeus Everwind at Mount Davis Weather Station. I have observed direct correlation between storm activity and infected behavior patterns. During electrical storms, infected demonstrate enhanced coordination, problem-solving, and potential communication. They appear to sense electrical fields and are drawn to electromagnetic energy. Barometric pressure drops correspond with increased infected aggression and coordination. Recommend all survivor groups monitor weather conditions as predictor of threat levels. Will continue broadcasting observations as conditions develop. As the day progressed and the storm continued to weaken, I compiled my notes and data into a more comprehensive analysis. The pattern was clear now. The infected weren't just influenced by the weather, they were transforming with it, evolving in response to atmospheric conditions. Each storm didn't just change their behavior temporarily, it seemed to leave them permanently altered, if subtly. They were learning, adapting, becoming more effective predators with each weather system that passed over them. This wasn't just a static apocalypse scenario. It was a dynamic one, with the threat evolving in response to environmental factors. Understanding this evolution might be key to long-term survival strategies. Weather forecasting hadn't become obsolete in this new world. It had become more critical than ever. The storm system finally moved east by the next morning, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Flash flooding had carved new channels down the mountainside, debris was scattered across the lower slopes, and numerous trees had been toppled by the intense winds. But the most significant transformation wasn't in the landscape, it was in the infected themselves. Through the telescope, I observed them in the valleys below, moving with noticeably different patterns than before the storm. They maintained loose group formations rather than wandering individually. They seemed to communicate through gestures and those speech-like vocalizations I'd first noticed during the height of the storm. Most concerning, they appeared to be establishing territories, with different groups claiming specific areas and defending them against other infected. They were organizing, evolving, becoming something beyond the mindless, shambling figures I'd first encountered in Lakeside. And based on the weather patterns I was tracking, another storm system would arrive within 48 hours, potentially accelerating this evolution further. I needed to understand what was happening on a deeper level. My observations had established correlation between weather events and infected behavior, but not causation. What was the mechanism behind this relationship? Was it purely the electrical energy in the atmosphere affecting their neurological systems? Or was something more complex occurring? The weather station's research database contained studies on bioelectrical fields in various organisms, research that had been conducted to understand how animals sense and respond to weather changes. I spent hours reviewing these studies, looking for insights that might explain what I was witnessing. One paper particularly caught my attention: research on slime molds and their ability to form network-like structures for resource distribution. These simple organisms, neither plant nor animal, could create efficient networks without any central coordination. More remarkably, their growth patterns sometimes mirrored atmospheric flow patterns when exposed to varying air currents. Could something similar be happening with the infected? Were they developing a kind of collective intelligence coordinated, not by individual thought but by shared response to environmental stimuli? The implications were frightening. If true, it meant the infected might continue to develop increasingly complex behaviors without any recovery of human intelligence. They would remain alien, operating on principles we couldn't understand intuitively. I needed to test my theories. Using the weather station's equipment, I set up a simple experiment. The facility had several emergency flares that generated both light and electromagnetic energy when activated. If my theory was correct, the infected should be attracted to this energy source even in the absence of a storm. Carefully, I placed a flare on a rocky outcropping about 50 yards from the station, using a remote trigger to activate it. The response was immediate and confirming. Infected from 3 different groups converged on the flare from different directions, drawn to its energy like moths to a flame. They remained gathered around it until the flare burned out, then dispersed again into their respective territories. This confirmed that electromagnetic energy was a primary attractant, independent of the storm itself. It also suggested a potential defense mechanism. Electromagnetic decoys could be used to draw infected away from survivor locations during evacuations or resource-gathering missions. I documented my findings meticulously, continuing to broadcast updates on emergency frequencies, though I'd received no confirmation that anyone was listening. The isolation was becoming psychologically challenging, but my scientific training helped me maintain focus on observation and analysis rather than dwelling on my situation. The day passed without further direct threats to the station. The infected remained at lower elevations, though I occasionally observed individuals looking up toward my position, as if aware of my presence but not currently motivated to attempt another assault. As the sun began to set, I noticed increased activity from the western groups of infected. They were gathering at the base of the mountain, forming a larger collective than I'd seen since the storm passed. Something had attracted their attention. Using the telescope, I scanned the area, looking for what might have drawn them together. What I saw sent a surge of both hope and anxiety through me. A vehicle, a large pickup truck, was carefully navigating the rural road that led toward the mountain. Survivors. Real, living humans, the first I'd seen since losing track of Alex at the gas station 2 days earlier. The infected had sensed them somehow, perhaps through the electromagnetic signature of the vehicle's engine, and were beginning to move in their direction. The truck was still a couple of miles away, but at their current speed, the infected would intercept them well before they reached the access road to the weather station. I had to warn them. The station's external warning system, normally used to alert field researchers about approaching severe weather, might be powerful enough to reach them. I activated the siren briefly, just long enough to get their attention without drawing more infected to the area. The truck stopped. Through the telescope, I could see two figures exit the vehicle, looking up toward the mountain. One raised binoculars, in my direction. They had spotted the weather station. I used the exterior lights to signal them. 3 quick flashes, the universal distress signal. They returned to their vehicle and continued toward the mountain, but now moving faster, apparently aware of the approaching threat. It became a tense race, the truck accelerating along the rural road, the infected converging from multiple directions. I could only watch, unable to intervene directly. The truck reached the base of the access road just as the first infected emerged from the tree line behind them. They began the ascent, the vehicle's engine straining against the steep grade. Several infected managed to grab onto the back of the truck but were dislodged when the driver swerved sharply around a switchback turn. The majority of the horde began climbing the access road on foot, their pace slow but relentless. The truck would reach the station well before them, but they would eventually arrive too. I prepared for the arrival of both the survivors and the pursuing infected. I unlocked the reinforced exterior door but kept the barricade in place until I could verify the newcomers weren't infected themselves. Through the security camera, I watched their approach. The truck pulled up to the station entrance, and 2 figures emerged quickly, a man and a woman, both wearing what looked like security uniforms from the lakeside water treatment facility. They pounded on the exterior door, glancing back frequently at the infected making their way up the mountain behind them. "Anyone in there? We saw your signal. Please, they're coming," the woman called out. I recognized her voice immediately. Dr. Eliza Chen, my friend, from the water treatment facility. The one who had left me the voicemail warning about water quality issues before everything collapsed. She had survived somehow. I moved the barricade and opened the door, ushering them inside quickly before securing it again. Eliza embraced me immediately while her companion, a security guard named Marcus according to his name tag, helped reinforce the barricade. "Thaddeus, I can't believe you made it," Eliza said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We've been searching for survivors with technical backgrounds. There's so much you need to know." As Marcus secured our position, Eliza quickly explained their presence. They had been part of a research team at the water treatment facility when the outbreak began. They had detected the biological contaminant early, but had been unable to prevent its release into the water supply. They'd been gathering data on the contamination and the resulting infection ever since, working from a secure laboratory at the facility until it was overrun during the storm. "We need your meteorological expertise," Eliza explained urgently. "The contaminant, it's not just biological, it has properties we've never seen before. It responds to electromagnetic fields, redistributes itself based on atmospheric pressure gradients. It's almost like it's using the infected as mobile vessels to spread itself according to weather patterns." She retrieved a laptop from her backpack and showed me their data, microscopy of the contaminant organism, charts of its response to various stimuli, maps of infection spread correlated with weather patterns. It confirmed many of my observations while adding crucial scientific context. "We think it's engineered," Marcus added, joining our conversation after securing the entrance. "No natural organism behaves this way. Someone created this thing and they designed it to use atmospheric conditions as part of its dispersal strategy. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a random outbreak. It was potentially a designed weapon, one that used Earth's own weather systems as a distribution network. And if Eliza's data was correct, the organism was still evolving, still adapting to its environment and hosts. "The storms are accelerating the adaptation," I said, showing them my own data on infected behavior changes following the weather system. "Each major weather event seems to trigger a developmental leap in the collective behavior of the infected. Eliza nodded grimly. That matches our observations. And there's something else you should know. The weather itself isn't natural anymore. The organism is affecting atmospheric conditions, creating feedback loops that generate these abnormal storm systems. It's like it's terraforming the environment to suit its needs. This explained the unusual storm patterns I'd been observing, their intensity, their unnatural movement patterns, the strange barometric pressure fluctuations. The infection wasn't just responding to weather, it was beginning to influence it. A chilling thought occurred to me. What if this was just the beginning? What if the organism's ultimate goal was to transform Earth's entire climate system? Our discussion was interrupted by the security system's alert. The first of the infected had reached the upper plateau and were approaching the station. Dozens of them now moving with purpose toward our position. We had perhaps 30 minutes before they would begin their assault on the building. We need to leave, Marcus insisted. We have the data we came for. We should head to the Green Valley base while we still can. Eliza looked uncertain. The truck won't outrun them on the descent. We'd be overrun before we reached the bottom. I considered our options, analyzing the variables just as I would approach a complex weather prediction. We need to change the atmospheric conditions, I said finally. The infected are most active under the current barometric pressure and electrical conditions. If we can temporarily alter those conditions locally, we might disorient them long enough to escape. How would we do that? Marcus asked skeptically. I pointed to the weather station's equipment array. This facility has cloud seeding materials, silver iodide primarily. It's used for certain types of atmospheric research. If we can disperse it into the atmosphere and trigger condensation, we could create a small, localized high-pressure system that might disrupt their coordination temporarily. It was a desperate plan, based on theoretical relationships between atmospheric conditions and infected behavior, rather than proven science. But it was the only option that offered a chance of escape without direct confrontation. Working rapidly, we prepared the cloud seeding equipment while monitoring the approaching infected. The materials would be dispersed by a compressed air system, spraying microscopic particles into the atmosphere above the station. Under normal circumstances, this would be used to study cloud formation and precipitation processes. Now it might save our lives. The infected are exhibiting pack behavior now, I explained as we worked. They coordinate based on shared response to atmospheric conditions. If we can disrupt those conditions suddenly, it might break their coordination temporarily, like electromagnetic interference disrupting a radio signal. As the infected reached the immediate vicinity of the station, we activated the seeding system. Silver iodide particles sprayed upward into the moisture-rich air above us, invisible to the naked eye but significant at a molecular level. The effect wouldn't be immediate. We needed the particles to serve as condensation nuclei, gathering moisture and altering the local pressure system. We watched through the security cameras as the infected began probing the building's defenses, looking for entry points. Their movements were coordinated, different individuals focusing on different potential weaknesses rather than all attacking the same point. They had definitely evolved since my first encounters in Lakeside. It's not working, Marcus said tensely after several minutes with no visible change in infected behavior. It needs time, I insisted, checking the atmospheric readings from our instruments. The pressure is already beginning to change, just a few more minutes. The barometric pressure was indeed rising slowly, as moisture condensed around the silver iodide particles, creating the beginnings of a localized high-pressure system. Temperature was dropping slightly as well, all subtle changes, but potentially significant to organisms that had demonstrated sensitivity to such fluctuations. After 10 tense minutes, we observed the first signs of impact. The infected's movements became less coordinated, individuals breaking from group patterns to wander more randomly. Some appeared disoriented, turning in circles or swaying in place. The collective assault on the building fragmented into individual uncoordinated actions. Now's our chance, I said, gathering essential data records and equipment. We need to move while they're disoriented. We loaded our materials into Marcus and Eliza's truck. then carefully emerged from the weather station. The infected nearest the building noticed us, but reacted sluggishly, their movements uncoordinated and ineffective. We reached the vehicle and began our descent down the access road, navigating around disoriented infected who barely seemed to register our passage. The effect wouldn't last long. The atmospheric disruption was minor and would stabilize soon, but it gave us the window we needed. By the time we reached the bottom of the access road, the infected on the upper slopes were beginning to reorganize, but we had gained crucial distance. As we sped toward the Green Valley base, Eliza explained more about what they had learned. The contaminant organism had been first detected in the municipal water supply 3 days before the outbreak became apparent. Initial testing had suggested it was a new type of cyanobacteria, but further analysis revealed structures unlike any known biological entity. It has properties of both viruses and bacteria, plus something else entirely, she explained. It can remain dormant in water for extended periods, then activate when introduced to a host system. Once active, it forms a network throughout the host's body, concentrating in the nervous system and gradually replacing normal functions with its own priorities, which appear to include responding to electromagnetic stimuli and atmospheric pressure changes. I added, connecting this with my own observations. Exactly. We think that's how they coordinate without direct communication. They're all responding to the same environmental cues, like a flock of birds turning simultaneously without a leader. The implications were both fascinating and terrifying. This wasn't just mindless aggression, it was an emerging system, an alternative form of intelligence developing within the shells of what had once been human hosts. And if the weather itself was beginning to be influenced by this system, we were facing something far beyond a conventional outbreak. The next storm system will arrive within 48 hours, I told them, sharing my meteorological analysis. Based on what we've observed, it will likely trigger another developmental leap in the infected. We need to prepare for that. The military scientists at Green Valley need to hear this, Marcus said. They've been developing containment strategies based on the assumption that the infected operate individually or in simple pack structures. If they're evolving into something more complex with each storm system, those strategies won't work. As we drove through the darkening landscape, I reflected on how my meteorological training had saved my life repeatedly during the crucial first 48 hours of the outbreak. Understanding patterns, predicting system behavior, recognizing the relationship between different environmental factors. These skills had proven unexpectedly vital in a scenario far removed from weather forecasting. Now that same knowledge might help humanity understand and potentially counter this evolving threat. The organism's relationship with weather systems was both its power and potentially its vulnerability. If we could disrupt the atmospheric conditions it relied on for coordination and development, we might find a way to halt its evolution before it transformed our world beyond recognition. The road ahead was long, both literally and figuratively. Green Valley was still hours away, and beyond that the challenge of sharing our knowledge and developing effective countermeasures remained. But for the first time since the outbreak began, I felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. My understanding of the atmosphere, of the patterns and systems that shape our world, might contribute to humanity's fight against this engineered apocalypse. As night fell and we continued our journey toward the military base, I watched the stars emerging in the clear post-storm sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a new community of survivors, and the continuing threat of the infected. But it would also bring the opportunity to apply science and understanding to combat fear and chaos. The storm had passed for now, but another was always on the horizon. My job remained what it had always been, to understand those storms, to predict their behavior, and to help others prepare for their impact. The context had changed dramatically, but the core of my purpose remained the same. I was still a meteorologist, still reading the atmosphere for clues about what was coming next. And in this new world, that knowledge might be more valuable than ever before. If you're watching this recording somehow, remember, survival isn't just about physical strength or weapons or supplies. It's about understanding the patterns around you, in the infected, in the environment, in everything. Stay observant, stay analytical, and watch the weather. In this new world, storm fronts bring more than just rain. They bring evolution, transformation, and escalating threat. The war for our world is just beginning, and the atmosphere itself has become both battlefield and weapon. This is Thaddeus Everwind. I survived the first 48 hours of the zombie apocalypse because I understood weather patterns. Now I'm using that same knowledge to fight for humanity's future. And the forecast, while uncertain, still contains hope. Even the strongest storms eventually pass. We just need to survive until they do.